2 autopsies, 2 states, 1 word, undetermined, that still won't let a family rest. A young man who called himself Nolan Wells's best friend sat down for an interview, and the friendship began unraveling in real time. Weeks later, the FBI walked into a case that had belonged to one small Mississippi county alone. This is an analysis of 2 autopsies, performed by 2 separate doctors. 2 documents that were supposed to give a grieving family the same answer. Instead, they gave them a mystery. Somewhere between the Mississippi coastline and a laboratory in Washington, D.C., something didn't add up. One examination happened first, close to home, under state authority. The second happened later, in a different city, carried out by a doctor the family trusted enough to send their son's body across state lines for. When that second doctor completed his report, he documented something the first exam hadn't fully explained, a finding that 2 credentialed experts still can't agree on the meaning of. He also noted something missing, something that should have accompanied the body and didn't. Both reports land on the same word, undetermined. But the forensic record isn't the only place where this case comes apart. There's a young man who called himself a best friend, someone who says he grew up beside Nolan Wells, until he sat down for an interview and the gaps in that friendship began showing in real time. Not long after that interview started circulating, federal investigators stepped into a case that, until then, had belonged to one small coastal county alone. Before any of that, it helps to understand who Nolan Wells was, and the last hours anyone saw him alive. On the 4th of July, 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells woke up in his Mississippi home like it was any other holiday. He was a wide receiver for Southwest Mississippi Community College, known by friends and coaches alike for a smile that arrived before he ever said a word. By every account given since, he was the kind of young man people gravitated toward without being able to fully explain why. His parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, would later describe him simply, a son who filled a room, who joked even in the middle of stress, who never missed a chance to check in on the people he loved. That morning, he left for Horn Island the way thousands of others along the Mississippi Gulf Coast did that day. A short boat ride, a holiday, friends, music, sunlight, water stretching out in every direction. Nothing about the start of that day suggested it would be the last time his family would speak with him as a living, breathing part of their world. By that evening, he was gone. Not gone in the way a person simply leaves early or loses track of time. Gone in the way that turns a family's entire world silent, one unanswered phone call at a time. 2 days later, on July 6th, his body was recovered near the island's shoreline. And in that instant, a family already gripped by fear was handed something even harder to carry, grief without an explanation. From that moment forward, his case would run through 2 separate autopsy rooms, examined by 2 separate doctors working under 2 entirely different sets of conditions. And the space between those 2 rooms, that gap in time, distance, and trust, is where this entire case would eventually come to rest. The first examination took place on July 7th, inside the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office, one day after Nolan's body was recovered. This followed the standard process any death investigation in Mississippi would follow. A body is recovered. A body is identified. It is examined by the office with jurisdiction over where it was found. On paper, procedurally, there was nothing unusual about how this began. It was simply what happens after a young life ends unexpectedly, and a family is left waiting on the other side of a phone for information no parent should ever have to receive. But waiting is exactly what happened next. Days passed. Christine and Elmore say that in the early stretch of this investigation, they didn't feel they were being told the full picture. They didn't feel the questions they were asking were being met with the same urgency they were living through every hour of every day. And so, in the middle of unimaginable loss, they made a decision most parents never have to consider. They chose not to simply wait on a system to give them answers. They chose to seek out a second, independent examination of their son, no matter what it took. It's a decision worth pausing on. A family in the rawest days of grief still found the resolve to push for more than they were being given. And that choice is the reason a second autopsy exists at all. The second examination happened 3 days later, on July 10th, nearly 1,000 miles away, inside a facility in Washington, D.C. This autopsy was not ordered by the state. It was requested and paid for by Nolan's own family, who made the decision to have his body transported out of Mississippi entirely. Think about what that decision actually required. A grieving mother and father, still absorbing the earliest days of loss, coordinating the transport of their son's remains across state lines because they needed someone independent to look at what happened to him. That is not a small decision. That is a family standing in the middle of devastation and refusing to accept silence as an answer. The doctor they chose was Dr. Roger Mitchell, the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, a position he held for 7 years, and at the time the sitting president of the National Medical Association, the oldest organization of black physicians in the country. He had no prior connection to Mississippi law enforcement and no obligation to align his conclusions with anyone else's. For a family desperate for honesty, that independence mattered more than almost anything else they could have asked for. By the time Dr. Mitchell began his work, nearly a week had passed since Nolan was found. His body had already been through one complete examination, had traveled hundreds of miles, and had continued to change with each passing day, the way any body does under those conditions. 2 doctors, 2 rooms, 2 very different starting points, and somewhere inside that gap sat a family still trying to plan a funeral and search for the truth at the exact same time. The first notable finding in Dr. Mitchell's report involved the back of the head, where he recorded an area of discoloration in the soft tissue. He did not call it proof of injury. He documented it plainly as an unexplained observation, without drawing a conclusion either way. That single sentence, buried inside a formal medical document, would go on to consume the attention of an entire nation. Once that finding became public, it became the single most discussed detail in the entire case, and it split forensic professionals almost immediately. Some pathologists who reviewed the documentation said the discoloration was consistent with changes a body naturally goes through after death. Others reviewing the same documentation said it was equally possible the discoloration reflected an earlier injury to that area, something that may have happened before Nolan ever entered the water. 2 independent, credentialed experts, the same finding, 2 conclusions in direct opposition. That disagreement isn't evidence of anyone hiding anything. It's the nature of forensic science when a body has already passed through one autopsy and several additional days of change before a second doctor ever examines it. But try explaining that nuance to a mother who simply wants to know what happened to her child. Try explaining scientific uncertainty to a father who has already buried his son and still doesn't have a straight answer to the only question that matters to him. Then came the second, more difficult finding. When Nolan's body arrived in Washington, certain internal structures from his neck were not included: his trachea, his hyoid bone, and cartilage from his larynx. These had been kept behind by the Mississippi Medical Examiner's Office during the first autopsy and were not sent along with the rest of the remains. Multiple outside forensic pathologists, with no connection to either side of the case, have said that retaining these structures during an initial autopsy is not by itself unusual. Examiners will often hold on to specific material for closer study or further testing. On its own, that decision proves nothing about intent. But Dr. Mitchell was direct about what that absence meant for his own examination. Without those structures in front of him, he could not complete a full assessment of Nolan's neck. He could not rule out a certain category of injury connected to that area, and he could not confirm one either. His report states this as a limitation of his examination, not an accusation against anyone. 2 things are true at the same time here, and both of them are heavy to sit with. Holding on to material for further testing is a standard, accepted forensic practice. And that same standard practice is the direct reason this case still doesn't have an answer. Somewhere in that contradiction is a family who understands, intellectually, that procedure is procedure, and who still has to live, emotionally, with the fact that a piece of their son was withheld from the doctor they trusted most to tell them the truth. Both reports, written independently by 2 different doctors in 2 different states, days apart, arrive at nearly identical conclusions. Manner of death, undetermined. Cause of death, undetermined. Pending further investigation. Not undetermined because someone is withholding the truth. Undetermined because, based on everything examined so far, that is precisely where the science currently stands. But for a family that has already said goodbye once, hearing that same word, undetermined, echoed back to them from 2 different cities, from 2 different doctors, is its own particular kind of heartbreak. It means the wait isn't over. It means the questions they've been carrying since the 4th of July are still theirs to carry, with no end date attached. So, if the forensic picture is this unresolved, one question becomes difficult to set aside. What actually happened on that island in the hours before anyone realized Nolan was missing? Among every account given in the weeks following his disappearance, one stands apart, not because it revealed new facts about what happened on the water, but because of what it revealed, almost by accident, about the people who were with him. It came from a long-form interview, close to 20 minutes in length, posted to the Officer Tatum Show, a podcast with a large and politically engaged audience. The young man being interviewed introduced himself as one of Nolan's closest friends. He said he was there to set the record straight on behalf of a group that had spent weeks under public suspicion. Weeks of their names being repeated online in connection to a tragedy they insisted they had nothing to do with. He described the friendship in the warmest terms available to him. He called Nolan a brother. He described a friend group that had known each other since high school, spending most weekdays and nearly every weekend together. By his account, this wasn't a handful of casual acquaintances who happened to share a boat that day. This was family in every sense but blood. For the opening minutes of that interview, viewers heard exactly what they expected to hear. Loyalty, closeness, grief from someone who says he lost a brother. Then the host asked a simple question. Had he ever been to Nolan's house? He hadn't. He explained that it had always been Nolan coming to him, never the other way around. Their group, he said, simply didn't operate that way. On the surface, a small answer. Underneath it, the first crack in a story that had otherwise sounded seamless. The follow-up questions kept pulling at that thread. Did Nolan's mother know who he was? He couldn't say with any certainty. Had he ever met her? He wasn't sure of that either. For someone who had just described Nolan as a brother, someone he said had grown up beside him for years, the absence of any real connection to his household, his mother, his home, stood out in a way that was difficult to ignore. That contradiction reached Nolan's mother directly. Her response was clear, and it carried a weight that no amount of online debate could soften. She said that when she looked at the names being connected to her son's final hours, she did not recognize most of them. Not as close friends, not as people who had ever set foot in her home, or she and theirs in return. Imagine sitting with that as a mother, watching strangers describe themselves as your son's brothers, while you search your own memory for their faces and come up empty. A friendship described publicly as brotherhood on one side. A mother who says she simply didn't know these people on the other. Somewhere between those two accounts is a truth that has yet to fully surface. The scrutiny deepened further once the true scale of that day came into focus. Early coverage suggested a small, contained group. It wasn't. According to multiple accounts, the outing on July 4th involved 3 boats and close to 200 people from a much wider circle, many of whom, this interview suggested, knew Nolan far less closely than the language of brotherhood implied. That detail alone reframed the entire day in the public's mind. Not an intimate gathering of longtime friends, but a sprawling crowd, where a single young man could slip out of sight and stay out of sight without anyone fully realizing it until it was far too late. Nolan's mother addressed the fallout with a restraint that, in its own way, said more than outrage ever could. She said she hadn't been closely following every piece of coverage in those days, consumed instead by grief and funeral arrangements, simply trying to survive each individual hour. She said she hadn't known the interview existed until others told her about it. And when she finally learned of it, her response wasn't anger. She said she wanted to see it eventually, but only alongside her family's trusted point of contact, someone who had stood beside her since the earliest hours of the search, someone she had come to lean on as this entire ordeal continued to stretch on, week after week, without resolution. None of this proves wrongdoing. That's important to say plainly, because it would be easy, in a case charged with this much public emotion, to let suspicion harden into certainty. But it exposes a contradiction nobody has fully explained. And it helps explain why, for so many following this case, trust in the story being told has been so difficult to hold on to. A grieving mother doing her best to hold her family together in public, while private questions about the people her son called friends remain unanswered. Before we get to where this case stands today, a few disputed details deserve a closer look, because not everything that spread about this story online turned out to be accurate. And separating fact from noise matters, especially for a family who has already had enough taken from them without misinformation adding to the weight. Start with the size of that gathering. Early coverage left the impression of a small outing, 4 or 5 people, easy to track, easy to question. It wasn't. Multiple accounts, later confirmed through independent reporting, put the number of people on Horn Island that day at close to 200, spread across 3 boats, all part of one extended social circle. Once that number is understood correctly, a lot of the suspicion around who was really there begins to make more sense. Not because anyone deliberately hit a smaller number to protect themselves, but because keeping track of one person inside a crowd that size on a day filled with sun, water, and celebration was never going to be simple for anyone, no matter how much they cared about him. Next, the delay before alarm was raised, a detail that continues to sit heavily with anyone who hears it for the first time. According to the account of the friend who eventually contacted authorities, it was not one of Nolan's friends who first noticed something was wrong. It was his mother, reaching out that night after growing concerned when she hadn't heard from her son, arriving at his friend's door before any of them had raised concern of their own. Picture that scene for a moment. A mother already worried, driving through the dark to a house full of young people who hadn't yet thought to ask where Nolan was. That gap between her fear and their silence is documented, not speculation. It's simply what the timeline, pieced together from those who were there, shows. Then there's the matter of Nolan's phone, a detail that, more than almost any other, generated intense speculation across social media for weeks on end. Online, it became a story about data being altered, about a device changing hands in ways nobody outside a small circle could fully explain. What actually happened, according to confirmed reporting, is more procedural than the online narrative suggested, though understanding it correctly still matters. Both families agreed to a mutual inspection of the phone, carried out through a neutral third-party process, with experts representing both sides present for the examination. As of now, this stands as a resolved step in an active investigation, not an open accusation. It doesn't erase every question people have about that device, but it shows both sides choosing transparency over silence, at least on this particular front. Finally, a claim that spread as widely as almost anything else in this case, and yet deserves considerably more scrutiny than it has generally received. According to one on-air account, a canine unit was reportedly offered to examine one of the boats involved that day, and the offer was said to have been declined by representatives connected to the family's legal team. This claim comes from a single source. It has not been confirmed by law enforcement, by any filing, or by any other party connected to the case. Until that changes, it belongs in this documentary as exactly what it is, unverified, resting on one person's word, not an established fact. By mid-July, a name few people following this case expected to see attached to it began appearing in local reporting out of Mississippi, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a case that had, until then, remained in the hands of one county sheriff's office, that development sent speculation into overdrive almost overnight. Online, the reaction was immediate and in many corners badly misinformed. Federal agents stepping into a small coastal county, on a case local law enforcement had, in its earliest hours, described using the word accident, to a public already deeply suspicious of how this investigation had been handled from the start. The FBI's arrival looked to many like confirmation that something far more serious was unfolding behind closed doors. The actual explanation, once officials provided one, is narrower than the speculation suggested, though no less significant. According to a statement from the agency, the FBI's involvement centers on two specific responsibilities, and neither of them, as of now, amounts to a declared homicide investigation. The first is assisting local investigators with the forensic examination of digital evidence already collected, work that requires specialized tools not every local department has in-house. Sheriff John Ledbetter addressed this directly, explaining that this kind of federal assistance isn't unusual for his office, and that Horn Island itself sits on federal land, giving the FBI a built-in jurisdictional connection to this case that existed long before any controversy did. The second responsibility deserves more attention than it has received, given how serious it is in its own right. The FBI confirmed it is actively investigating a series of interstate threats made against individuals connected to this case. One of Nolan's friends, one of the three young men who had been on the boat with him that day, said publicly that he and others in his circle had been receiving direct threats online since the case first gained national attention. He said plainly that he and his friends had done nothing wrong, and that he didn't understand the volume of hostility being directed at people his age who were simply trying to answer questions honestly. That danger wasn't limited to Nolan's immediate friend group. A sitting Mississippi judge, whose stepson was one of the three young men aboard that boat, revealed publicly that her own family had received a wave of death threats in the days following the case's escalation online. In a written statement, she said the threats would not stop the truth from eventually coming out, and she emphasized that her family remained fully willing to cooperate with Nolan's family and their legal team, sharing everything they knew in the hope that both families could eventually arrive at the answers they were each searching for. Think about what that means. Two families on opposite sides of unbearable suspicion, both saying in their own way that they simply want the truth, both living under the weight of public anger that neither of them fully asked for, both trying to protect their children, their households, their sense of safety, while a case with no resolution continues to play out in front of millions of strangers online. So yes, the federal government is involved in this case. That much is confirmed on the record and isn't in dispute. But it's involved for reasons distinct from what a large share of online commentary has assumed. This is not, at this stage, a declared federal homicide investigation, and nothing in the FBI's own statement suggests that it is. What it actually represents is digital forensic support, layered on top of a separate and serious effort to protect people on multiple sides of this case. Friends, family members, even extended relatives of witnesses, from threats that had begun escalating well beyond what any local department could safely manage on its own. Getting that distinction right matters, not to diminish the FBI's presence in this story, but because misunderstanding why they're here has already fueled a version of this case that isn't grounded in anything actually confirmed. Which brings this documentary to where the case genuinely stands today. The state's full findings, including toxicology results, remain outstanding weeks after Nolan's body was recovered. Both autopsy reports, the one completed in Mississippi and the independent examination conducted afterward in Washington, D.C., list manner and cause of death as undetermined, pending further investigation. That word, undetermined, has not changed since either report was filed. No charges have been brought against anyone connected to this case. No official determination of foul play has been made in either direction, not confirming it and not ruling it out. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has confirmed the investigation remains open and active, with detectives continuing to work through digital evidence, follow-up witness interviews, and outstanding forensic results as each piece comes in. For Nolan's family, none of that offers anything resembling closure. What it offers instead is a continued and exhausting wait, stretched across weeks that were never supposed to unfold this way, weeks that began with a holiday on the water and have not yet ended with an answer. His mother has said, in her own words, that all she and her family are asking for is honesty, whatever that honesty ultimately reveals about what happened to her son. Not a specific outcome, not a particular villain, just honesty. That request remains unanswered tonight, just as it has every night since his body was found along that shoreline. Somewhere in Mississippi, a family is still setting a place at the table for a young man who should be there. Somewhere in that same state, an investigation continues, slowly, carefully, without any promise of when it will end. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He had a second season of football ahead of him at Southwest Mississippi Community College, a family that adored him, and a smile that people remember before they remember anything else about him. What this case still doesn't have, not yet, is an answer. 2 autopsies, conducted independently by 2 credentialed doctors, couldn't fully provide one. A widely circulated interview meant to close the door on public suspicion only opened new questions instead. And a federal investigation, however necessary, has not closed the distance between what this family knows and what they still need to know. Until that distance closes, the most honest thing anyone can offer Nolan's family is exactly what they've asked for from the beginning: patience for a process that is still unfolding, and a commitment to following the truth wherever it actually leads, not wherever speculation wants it to go. If you want this case followed closely, with every new development covered as it's confirmed, subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here for whatever comes next. And in the comments, tell me, out of everything covered in this case so far, what's the one detail that still doesn't add up for you?